Sporting Journal Radio, presented by Onyx.
Well, snow goose hunting in the spring or even in the fall for that matter has become one of my favorite waterfowl activities. I think snow geese are fascinating. The journey they go through, the big flocks, the massive amount of numbers, and just the resiliency of the species overall. And the fact that we have to have a season or we've had a season, a conservation order on them in the spring to reduce population numbers. It's just, they're a pretty hardy bird. And the more and more I learn about them, the more interesting they get to me. And Dan was on a hunt recently in one of the Dakotas, we'll say, and you guys shot a banded snow over there, Dan.
Yeah, we did. It was a pretty unique bird. It's one we probably won't see ever again in our lives. We had it was a juvenile snow, but it had this special green tarsal band, and if you're a waterfowler, you know how special that is to see. And we were all pretty jacked up, and it was pretty special, but we didn't know a whole lot about it until we got the banding report. And it's just, they're cool to see, and it's fun to get the information on them and learn more about them. They're considered a trophy, but to me, that information's the coolest piece about them. So.
Absolutely. We rarely see banded snows in general, but to see one with a tarsal band. Now, I know your Photoshop skills. I was like, all right, Dan.
They're not that good.
Well, that's true.
Ask anybody. They'll tell you.
That's a pretty special bird to see, right? And then, when we were talking to our buddies about it a little bit, we learned, it's a young bird. Gosh, I didn't know there were tarsal bands going on, snows or young snows. So I did a little bit of research. I talked to Nick Dawson, who I've gotten to know over a couple years, and he's up in Alaska doing research up there. And then he said, this is the guy to talk to. He's the guy behind this research, and it's Vijay Patil, and he joins us now here on the show. He's a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey up there in Anchorage, Alaska. Vijay, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So how do you get excited when you see reports when like, oh my gosh, that was a bird that I banded and that's where it got shot? Wow, that's really cool. Do you get excited about that? Like hunters, like what Dan was talking about is, me personally, I love learning about the migration patterns and where these birds have gone, what they're doing, learning about their habits, how old they are. I love learning about that stuff. Is it work for you, or do you get excited about that stuff?
Oh no, I love it. It's one of my favorite parts of the job. I will say I tend to see more bands than probably the average hunter, since we're putting out 1,000 or so a year on the species. But yeah, the band reports that we get from hunters through the reportband.gov website and the bird banding lab are a huge part of my research. It's how we learn about their survival rates, the effect of harvest, where they're going during the wintering grounds. And like you said, we get to learn about how long they live and find out that some of these geese are living for more than 20 years. And it's a huge source of information. And it's one of my favorite parts of the job is interacting with hunters and getting to see pictures of these birds that I've known as goslings on the breeding grounds and seeing what happened in the rest of their life. And, I don't get down to the wintering grounds that much. So I think it's a two-way street. I get to learn a lot, and I get excited whenever a hunter gets in touch with me.
So this tarsal band, this bird was banded. It was a young bird. What was the data on it, Dan, again? Do you remember?
I'll pull it up here. So you can see there, it was juvie banded last year in July 31st, 2021. I was too young to fly. I was a female and banded up in, those are some cities I don't know how to pronounce. somewhere in Alaska.
North Slope. We'll just say
I can say North Slope. It's the other ones I can't say. But yeah, pretty neat to see. Yeah, and then shot in North Dakota.
You do 1,000 of these a year or so. Is there ever a band report that comes back? You're like, I know him. Like, I remember banding that bird.
I don't know that I've remembered a single band, just because, there's so many cycling through. But yeah, so that was last year, and that's near the village of Nuiqsut. And that is at a breeding colony on the Colville River Delta, which is on the North Slope. It's about 50 miles west of Prudhoe and Dead Horse in the oil fields. And it's a pretty young snow goose colony, where really from, geese didn't start nesting there until maybe about 2005.
Oh, really?
And since, yeah, it's a very young colony that's just taken off and exploded. It's growing at something like 30% per year based on the aerial surveys and some of the banding data that we've got.
Wow.
So yeah, we're really interested to understand what's going on with that population and what's driving that rate of increase and how they're spreading out and using the habitat, and how the snow goose population is starting to affect other birds in the area and that sort of thing.
So is that basically the reason for this research that's going on then right now?
Well, that is sort of the focus now. I will say this project, the banding project that bird was banded for, started as a project to understand really climate change effects on waterfowl breeding in the Arctic. So we wanted to look at reproductive success and mortality associated with year-to-year changes in the timing of when the snow melts and when the birds are able to start nesting, and when the vegetation starts to green up and grow, and how that affects the goslings. But as I said, when we first started this work, there were hardly any snow geese nesting in this delta, in this population. And then as the snow goose population established and started to take off, we realized that that was really what we needed to focus on and understand, how that would affect brant and other species that are nesting in the same area.
That's fascinating.
So that's really the focus right now.
So do you think that the reason that they started breeding there is because of what they're doing across the tundra? Are these like mid-continent snow geese? Are they just spreading out because of what they're doing to the tundra, the breeding grounds up in the tundra?
That's a great question. I will say we don't really have the answer just yet. That's one of the questions that I want to answer the most. So I'm working on some population models now using that banding data to try to understand how much of the growth we're seeing on the Colville and in Alaska is attributed to Alaskan conditions like nesting success in Alaska, and how much of it is due to immigration from outside. And I will say that it's still preliminary, but the results we have right now say that we shouldn't be able to get the rate of increase we're seeing unless there is some immigration coming from another population. And so, yeah, it seems plausible that there are central flyway birds they're moving west, and that may have been what started this colony and what might be continuing to fuel this incredible rate of increase.
That's crazy. So
we don't have that answer yet.
And that colony started in 2005, is that what you said?
Somewhere around then.
Okay.
And actually, for the North Slope in general, until relatively recently, there have been hardly any major snow goose breeding areas there. There was a small colony of a few hundred that was near Prudhoe Bay that's been around for a long time, but for decades, the North Slope just was not a major player in snow goose breeding. And the Colville is one of a couple of sites. There's also the Pickbuck River Delta, which is maybe 50 miles farther to the west, that have established just in the last couple of decades and have really taken off.
Yeah. I mean, when I've thought about Pacific Coast snow geese, those are the ones that come over from Russia generally, isn't it? And then you think of the birds that come. Go ahead.
Yeah. So there's two sorts of populations that we think of within the Pacific Flyway. There's the Western Arctic snow geese, which include our North Slope birds, but the majority of those up to now have been breeding in Canada, mostly in this colony on Banks Island, which is in Nunavut. And then there's also the Wrangel Island population, which is in Russia. And those birds do kind of mingle with the Western Arctic snows down on the wintering grounds, but they take somewhat different migration paths. So most of the Wrangel Island birds are kind of migrating down along the coast, whereas our birds are heading east, kind of staging in the 1002 area or around there for a few weeks in the fall and merging up with these Banks Island birds. And then they kind of head south past the Rockies through the prairies in Alberta in that area, and then kind of split and mostly go into like California and Central Valley. But some of them go to wintering grounds that are farther to the east where they're sort of overlapping with central flyway birds.
Okay, this wasn't a planned question, but how do these birds know where they're going? I think that's a question nobody seems to have an answer for. Like, are they using the magnetic poles? Are they using landmarks? Are they following other birds? How do they know where they're going? Is it imprints?
Yeah. That's a great question. And, for different birds, the answer seems to be different. So a lot of birds are able to sort of navigate based on magnetic field lines. With the snow geese, based on their migration tracks, it does kind of seem like they're following these landmarks where they're sort of heading down along the Mackenzie River Delta and then, along the edge of the Rockies and then splitting down from there once they get down into the U.S. So I think a lot of it is sort of geographic, and, they do seem to be sort of learning from their parents. So one of the reasons why we put tarsal bands on the young females, but not the young males from this population, is because the females will tend to migrate back up to the breeding colony where they were born, whereas the males will sort of disperse and go to other breeding colonies once they meet up with other folks on the wintering grounds. So there does seem to be some learning, some using of landmarks, and maybe some other things we just haven't learned about yet.
Yeah, the women go back. The men like to chase women wherever they're going back to, right? I mean that.
Right.
How are do snows? How long do they pick new mates every year, or what? Or is it? Are they kind of?
They will stick with the same mate, but if their mate is killed, then they will acquire a new mate.
I got a feeling this could turn into a really long interview, so I better because I love this stuff. So I'm going to keep things. Let's back up to this current research with that tarsal band. Why? Like, how many birds are you banding, and how many are getting the the metal leg bands, and how many are getting the tarsal bands?
Yeah, so as I said, we try to band about 1,000 new birds each year, and this is a banding program that's been going on for a little over a decade. We've been banding every year since 2011, except for 2020, where we had to cancel because of COVID. And each of those birds that we capture gets a metal band, and then when we recapture them in subsequent years, we can write down the metal band number and get some information about survival and fidelity to the site and that sort of thing. And then, as I mentioned, we've only been putting the tarsal bands, the plastic green guys, on the young females. And that's because our main interest was being able to re-site these birds when they came up to the breeding grounds. And we just weren't able to do that with the males because they were,
Sure.
largely going somewhere else. And we don't like to disturb the birds or add tags or markings to them unnecessarily unless we've got a specific purpose for it. And since that was our specific purpose, we decided we're only going to add that extra band to the young females since we have a chance of seeing them.
So every young female basically is getting one of those then?
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha.
And, that being said, although, we did it mostly for our purposes resetting up north, it's still, we get a lot of useful information from folks down on the wintering grounds. Even if you don't see the bird or shoot the bird and report it, we have birders who take pictures with their telephoto lens and can give us the combination. And that still gives us great information about the population status and survival rates and all that.
What are you using for the metal bands? Are they what kind of material? Are they stainless, or what are you using there? So
different bird types of species will get different types of bands, but we do have aluminum metal bands that we put on these birds. And they last for an incredibly long time.
Are neck collars still being used, or has that gone away?
Yeah, so neck collars for the most part are not being used for this type of resighting, so you don't see these big plastic neck collars too much anymore. They tend to be a little bit harder on the birds compared to the leg bands, and so again, we're trying to minimize impacts wherever we can. We do still use some neck collars that are outfitted with GPS trackers. There's some really incredible technology now where these lightweight collars with little solar panels so the batteries last forever. They can automatically transmit to and send out location data on the cell phone network. So we can get all this great remote migration information from these birds.
Could you tell me where those are right now by any chance? That'd be great.
I think that study's pretty much wrapped up. I don't think any of the collars we put out are still online anymore.
Okay.
Unfortunately, but it is an incredible source of information. I mean, the technology that we've got now is just remarkable compared to a decade ago.
Yeah, I shot a mallard a couple of years ago that was part of a research study here in Minnesota that Bruce Davis did, and he was putting backpacks on, a bunch of them, and unfortunately he had just put it on about 2 weeks before the season started, and I ended up shooting it early in the season, so there wasn't a lot of data, but what was there, and I apologized to him. He goes, no, this is good because we're recovering the equipment first of all, but we'll still be able to take everything we've learned off of that. And the study was to determine how much hunting pressure actually forced birds to migrate. And so they were able to determine on opening weekend, the bird traveled about 7 miles to another marsh. We figured due to hunting pressure, but then we could figure out what fields it was going to. It was a hen mallard. We figured out what fields she was going to feed in, where she was roosting. I mean, you could figure out the daily pattern of this bird. Even for the 2 weeks, it was just a wealth of information that was just fascinating. So he sent me a little map with all the lines of where this bird went. And then after a couple of days in the southern marsh, it flew back to the original one after the hunting pressure, I suppose, kind of died down, or maybe it got kicked off of that one and pushed back over, or whatever the case may be. But it didn't leave. It didn't migrate because of hunting pressure in any case. There it is right there. And it was so funny because, well, I've told this story in the show before. I don't need to get into it, but I was hunting with a bunch of buddies, and one of them, they had gone out to eat the night before. We had gone out to eat the night before, and one of the guys left his car keys at the restaurant. So that morning we were getting ready to pack up and head home, and he had to go back to the restaurant to get the keys. Well, everybody else on the trip was like, let's go and, have a beer and some lunch or whatever. And I said, well, I'm going to stay here and just kind of hunt in the morning. And I ended up sending him a picture of this banded mallard with a backpack on it, and they were all pretty jealous of that. It was pretty comical.
Awesome.
But
yeah, and like you say, like we get a lot of information, even just short-term behavioral information of movements in the habitat from these birds, even if they get shot right away. So we don't want hunters to feel nervous about calling in a bird with a radio tag or something like that. And I know sometimes folks really want to keep the tag because they want to have a mount with this really cool thing on the bird. And most of the folks I know who put out radio tags like that have some dummies sitting around, dummy tags. So if you call it in, we want the tag back because it's expensive and there's lots of data, but usually we'll be happy to send you something that looks just the same so you can get that mount set up the way you want it.
And I got a replica for mine, so that was great. And that's important. I mean, all that data, that's important. I mean, obviously you get some from birders who just spot these birds here and there, but you want to hear from people. I mean, that's the whole point. Like, hunters basically are the number one source of info for researchers, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, waterfowl banding is really like the largest citizen science research program that I know of going on today. So we couldn't do the analyses that we do and understand the population status of these birds without the input from hunters calling in these bands.
So we talked about this relatively new population of snows that you've been researching, and it's been growing 30% a year, and some of that is most likely due to an influx of birds that were maybe breeding somewhere else in the northern regions up there. But overall, the hatch has been pretty good. Or how was the hatch this year up there?
This year, I don't know.
Or last year, I guess.
Unfortunately, we weren't there for nesting last year, so I don't have those numbers. But just based on these aerial surveys that are done each year during the brood rearing period, the population, was almost double during the brood rearing period last year from what it was in the aerial surveys the year before. So I think they did before. And you alluded to how snow geese are just incredibly impressive and resilient, and that's exactly what we see. Like, every year they have pretty amazingly high nest success. The parents are just excellent at defending their nest and hatching successfully, and they just do a good job. I mean, even without the immigration, I think their population would be growing fast because it's great habitat and they're great at what they do.
So we all know the story of what they're doing to the habitat up in the, their nesting tundra grounds up there. What are they doing? What have you seen? This is probably a great way to monitor what they're doing to habitat, being that's a relatively new colony up there. What are they doing to the ground up there?
Yeah, that's one of the exciting things about studying this population, is getting to see how these habitat impacts might develop. I will say that the environment at this population in Alaska is very different from the environment and the populations in Hudson Bay and the Central Arctic flyways. So we don't necessarily expect the impacts to be the same. And for the first half of this study period up till now, we haven't really seen major impacts. We've done studies on gosling growth and found that they're still growing at higher rates than most other populations. There's plenty of food for them. And actually, there's some research showing that as permafrost thaws and the coastal habitat sinks, it's converting some freshwater meadows into this salt marsh habitat that's their favorite thing to raise their young on. So in a sense, it seems like the amount of food out there for them might continue to increase with some of the changes that we're seeing. But I will say, we've just in the last couple of years, as the population has gone, through the roof, we are starting to see major changes in the vegetation. We've got grazing impact transects set up and to measure long-term changes. And that's going to be the focus of the work this year. And we're just starting to see those impacts, and I'm really excited to look for evidence of habitat degradation in the next couple of years.
Yeah, there's a picture, and Dan, maybe you can do a quick Google search and find this. There's a great picture, and I'm not sure where it came from exactly, but it's a small fenced-off square. You probably know exactly what I'm talking about. And you can see it looks like a golf course around it, and then it looks like CRP inside there, and it's to show the effects of snow geese foraging up there.
And I'm guessing that is from this place called La Perouse Bay in central Manitoba. That was actually where I got my start studying snow geese when I was an undergrad. And that was this colony where the population skyrocketed several decades ago. Yep. And you can see they just totally overgrazed the surrounding landscape. And there what happened was once they had sort of mowed down the vegetation, as the water evaporated from the bare ground, it brought a lot of salt up to the surface. And so it created this sort of salt-killed, highly saline landscape where the plants couldn't grow back. As I said, I'm not sure that that's exactly what's going to happen at our site. One of the differences is the Hudson Bay area, the ground is actually rebounding because it's recovering from the weight of this massive ice sheet sitting on top of it during the Ice Age. Whereas, at our site, the ground is kind of sinking so that this area that can have salt marsh vegetation is continuing to expand. So there's some interesting differences, but as I said, just in the last couple of years when we went back, we were starting to see these sorts of changes where places that had knee-high vegetation went back and it looked like the geese had taken a weed whacker to it.
Yeah. Huh. That's amazing. I'd never heard that about the salt coming up through the ground like that and keeping any new growth from happening. That's interesting. Were you always interested in snows, or what got you started in that field?
Yeah, so I actually sort of came to snows through my interest in Arctic biology, as opposed to, I know a lot of folks get into this kind of Arctic work through their interest in waterfowl, and for me it was the other way around. But yeah, when I was an undergraduate, I was looking for a summer job, and I had a professor who had this field camp up in the Hudson Bay where the snow goose colony was, and he took me up there, and that was my first introduction to the Arctic and my first introduction to snow geese, and just what incredible species they were and how profoundly they could affect the environment.
Who was that?
That was a guy named Evan Couch.
Okay.
He's a population ecologist who's been really involved in this piece of software called MARC, which is one of the main tools we use for analyzing marker capture data. But it's also, that project was led by a guy named Robert Rockwell with the American Museum of Natural History. Rocky, you may be familiar with it.
I've had him on the show before, and I thought doing that snow goose research would be fascinating until he told me he'd been in like 6 or 7 helicopter crashes. I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah, I haven't been quite that unlucky, but I also haven't been doing it nearly as long as he has. So I was just a dumb little undergrad who got to tag along on that project years ago, and that kind of hooked me. And then I did a bunch of different kinds of work working with other Arctic species and circled back to snow geese when I got this job at the USGS.
It's interesting research, and I don't know how much I'm sure you're aware of it, but I don't know how much your research involves this avian influenza, this avian flu that's really affected snow geese and Canada geese and other waterfowl all the way. I mean, hunters throughout the Dakotas and up and down the flyway here in the States just saw dead birds everywhere, or birds falling out of the sky. I mean, it definitely seems like this year it's been a bigger outbreak than years past.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. And I will say that the disease monitoring is not really my area of expertise. So I'm trying to coordinate closely with some other folks in my office who do a lot of the wildlife disease monitoring to understand what's going on with this outbreak and what it might mean for these birds and their breeding populations. But we're definitely going to be keeping in touch with the disease folks and trying to make a plan so that we can do our work safely up on the breeding population and make sure we know what to look for so we can understand how this outbreak is spreading. But it's something for hunters to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild to think that, I mean, how long do you think these birds had it before it becomes fatal for them? I mean, just to fly that far and then just all of a sudden fall out of the air, you suppose they're catching it on the way down from other birds? It just kind of keeps snowballing as they migrate? I
really don't think I can answer that question very well. I don't know exactly at what point they got it, but there are a number of different strains of avian influenza that have different levels of lethality or severity for the birds. And, there's sort of like our flu, there's always like something that's circulating in the population. But as for what's driving, the sudden outbreak of this more lethal strain, I really don't know.
You were part of some research last fall about influenza A viruses in Alaska wetlands. Is that right?
Yeah, and I was really just assisting with some of the survival analyses, or the analyses to understand how long the virus itself was surviving. And this was some work that was led by my colleague Andy Ramey and other folks in my office, the Alaska Science Center, where they wanted to know if and for how long some of these avian influenza viruses could persist in the landscape. And so they're actually taking viruses from birds, from swabbing birds' cloacas, and inoculating them in natural ponds out in Alaska. And what was kind of amazing was we were finding that some of these viruses are actually persisting in the landscape, like not in a bird, for as much as a year. So it's not just that there's sort of reservoirs within the bird population, but there's viruses that are just in the environment, in the water.
And for that to stick around in water for over a year and go through the freeze thaw cycle, it's kind of amazing to think about that. Yeah.
This was my first foray into working on the sort of virus analysis with Andy and his folks, and yeah, it was pretty amazing to me as well.
So what you need to do now is next time you put a tarsal band on, you need to take a picture of yourself putting it on there, and then go on a hunt in Arkansas or South Dakota. And then this is have you ever heard this story about Nick Dawson? He put up, I think, a neck collar on.
And I know some other friends with similar stories.
Yeah. He put a neck collar. I think it was a neck collar on a speckled belly, on a white front. And then he was on the hunt, or he was hunting with the guys that shot it. I can't remember the exact story, but basically he was in Arkansas and he was either with the guys that shot it either the day before or that day or something, but they ended up shooting the bird that I think he's got a picture of himself putting the neck collar on, and he was there when it got shot, which is pretty wild.
Yeah, and I have another friend, Chris Nicolai, who you might know the name as well. He used to be at Fish and Wildlife. He's now at Delta Waterfowl, who is actually collaborating with us on some of this GPS collar work. And I think he came up to my site to put some GPS collars on snows. And then later on that year, I think he was looking at the data and realized that one of the birds he had just collared was flying over his house down in South.
That's crazy. It's fascinating stuff, man. What is there any other wild migration pattern stories that you can share with us?
Yeah, I can't think of any offhand. I mean, except that the journey that these birds make every year, most of these migratory birds, it's really just amazing to think about. They fly from the North Slope, from the Arctic Refuge, down to their wintering grounds in really just a straight push. They might stop for a few days here and there, and on the way up in the spring, they do stage in the prairies for a few weeks. But it's really a matter of days or weeks before they're from Alaska down to the California Central Valley, or Texas and Louisiana. And that in itself, just the normal migration pattern they do every year, is still just boggles my mind to think of it.
That spring migration, even if you don't hunt, just witnessing it is something I think everybody needs to see. I remember the first time when I moved to North Dakota, and I didn't grow up hunting snow geese. When I moved to North Dakota, I had some buddies that were like, "Oh, you haven't hunted snows before? Let's check this out." And I heard about it, and it was one of those days where the big push was on, and I couldn't hunt, but I took 2 hours and I just drove west until I could find snow geese. And I remember just pulling over on this gravel road, and it was just the entire horizon was just strings of flocks of snows heading north. It was one of those good migration days, and I just sat there for hours watching snows just pile over the top of me when those adults head back north. They're in a hurry, and it's quite the spectacle to see for sure.
Absolutely.
All right, Vijay Patil, wildlife biologist with the USGS up in Alaska. Fascinating stuff. feel free to invite us along next time you do some banding, because we'd love to see it. And we just any excuse to go to Alaska is a good one. But no, anytime you find some interesting research and want to come back on, let us know. Otherwise, we might reach back out to you at some point. But thank you. I appreciate you coming on to tell us about that tarsal band and what research is going on there, and just giving us an update on a new colony of snow geese breeding in Alaska, which I wasn't expecting that to be part of this. So that's really cool. Interesting.
Yeah. And we expect the change that we're seeing in that landscape to continue. And I'll just close and say, like, I really appreciate you guys having me on and the chance to talk about the banding program and how important it is. So just remind all the folks listening that if you do get a banded bird, please report it. There's a website right on the band at www.reportband.gov, so we can get that information that we need.
Well, waterfowl hunters love their bands, but I think the real trophy is learning about the migration research, honestly. I mean, we all like to wrap them on lanyards or put them on mounts and all that stuff, but learning the behaviors of these birds is the best part of it, I think. Vijay, thanks for the time today on the show.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Hear more at sportingjournalradio.com or wherever you get podcasts.
Did you know there are more than 1,000 lakes in Ottertail County?
Yep, and I'm gonna fish as many as I can. I'm an outdoorsy otter. Nothing beats a full day of fishing for me. The lakes of Ottertail County give me plenty of options to lower my boat and snag the perfect catch. Not an outdoorsy otter? No problem. Ottertail County has something for everyone. You just need to find your inner otter.
To find your inner otter, go to ottertaillakescountry.com.